Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression and Hoover's response. Now, I like to read a biography on every president I talk about. So, for this series of lectures, I used Gene Edward Smith's FDR. It's a pretty good one-volume history of FDR. The main book I used to write these lectures was David M. Kennedy's Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War. And then I took two books that kind of take a critical look at FDR. The first is Jim Powell's FDR's Folly, How Roosevelt and His New Deal Prolonged the Great Depression. And then the other one is Burton Folsom Jr.'s New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America. So I took those four books to kind of write these lectures on the Great Depression and the New Deal. So if you want to use your guided notes, we'll be on pages 1 and 2 of the Great Depression, New Deal, and World War II. Okay, the Great Depression would be the worst economic crisis in American history. It brought the Roaring Twenties to an end. Historians place the years of the Depression from 1929, the year the stock market crashed, to 1941 when America entered World War II. The unemployment rate would reach 25%. It never went below 14%, and it averaged 17% for the entire decade. It would wipe out the savings and threaten the homes of millions of Americans. It would remove Herbert Hoover from power and catapult FDR to the presidency. FDR and his New Deal would forever alter the role and power of the federal government. Taken together, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II would totally transform America. America went from having a federal government that was small in size and limited by Jeffersonian principles to having a government that saw itself as responsible for the well-being of its citizens through the welfare state, harnessing never-before-imagined powers over its citizens' lives and money. World War II caused America to abandon its principles of isolationism held onto for centuries since George Washington's farewell address, in which he warned Americans of the dangers in becoming entangled politically and militarily with other countries. After World War II, America became one of the main players on the international stage. And I got a great quote from Kennedy's book. He says, "The Great Depression would open, quote, a fissure across the landscape of American history no less gaping than that opened by the volley on Lexington Common in April 1775, or by the bombardment of Sumter on another April 66 years later." So basically, the Great Depression opened up a time in American history that was just as transformative as the American Revolution and the Civil War. Now, the Great Depression was not ended by the New Deal. Kennedy says, quote, "The Depression and the New Deal, in short, were Siamese twins, enduring together in a painful but symbiotic relationship that stretched to the end of the decade." So one of the main things I want you to remember is don't think that FDR and his New Deal ended the Great Depression. They didn't. Most historians believe World War II ended the Great Depression, although I'll show you some historians don't believe that. Okay, so the first signs of distress in the economy occurred in September 1929. That's when stock prices fell unexpectedly, but then they soon recovered. But then in October, you had some more bad news. On October 23rd, there came a flood of selling. 6 million shares were sold that day. $4 billion was wiped out. The next day, October 24th, was called Black Thursday. Almost 13 million shares were traded. $9 billion was wiped out by noon of that day. Although later that evening, some of that wealth was captured back, so there was a slight recovery. And then the next week, October 29th, something called Black Tuesday occurred. About 16.5 million shares were traded. The stock market continued to plummet for weeks. By mid-November, $26 billion was wiped out. Now, a lot of historians have looked at this and said, what caused the stock market to crash? And despite the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, there were cracks in the American economy. American agriculture had been experiencing a bad decade during the 20s. Automobile manufacturing and residential construction had slowed. Business inventories began to pile up. In 1927, Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of Commerce under President Coolidge, he labeled what he called the orgy of mad speculation in the stock market. You know, everyone, individuals, corporations, and banks, they all seem to be putting their money into the stock market hoping to make a quick buck. John Kenneth Galbraith wrote that, quote, "It seems as though Wall Street was devouring the money of the entire world." Now, there were three main sources of money that fueled the rise in the stock market. Those were individuals, corporations, and banks. Banks were probably the most troubling. Banks would loan money to buy stocks on margin. Buying stocks on margin meant that a stock would be purchased by leveraging a cash payment, sometimes 10 to 50%, with a loan secured by the value of the stock. If the stock started to drop in price, the lender could call for repayment if the price dropped below a certain level. So there was probably a lot of unhealthy purchasing of stock in the late 1920s, and eventually the stock market just needed to correct itself. That's actually how a lot of people at the time saw it. This crash is just a correction. Now there's a couple myths associated with the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. So one of those is the crash did cause the Great Depression. Now that's not true. The stock market, like I said, the crash was a correction. Stock prices had doubled since 1928. New York Times financial writer Alexander Dana Noyes regarded the crash as, quote, "a reaction from an orgy of reckless speculation." Stock prices started to rebound, and by April 1930, they regained about 20% of their prices. Industrial stock prices were back at the prices they were at the beginning of 1929. Now that's still double their price in 1926. And unlike previous Wall Street panics, no major bank or company failed this time in 1929. Another myth associated with the crash is that the crash wiped out many Americans. The New York Stock Exchange at the time estimated that 20 million Americans owned stock. You know, there's all kinds of stories about Americans being wiped out by the crash and committing suicide out of despair. But the truth is, most Americans didn't own stock. The chief actuary of the Treasury Department determined that about 3 million Americans owned stock in 1928. That's about 2.5% of the population. So that means the average American, 95.7%, did not own stocks in 1929. So theoretically, the crash wouldn't really have affected them. Now, Hoover is president when the crash happens, and the citizens of the United States feel that they have a president who knows how to handle this crisis, and they expect great things from the great engineer. The journalist Anne O'Hare McCormick, she wrote in March of 1930, quote, "The whole country focused on Washington. We had summoned a great engineer to solve our problems for us. Now we sat back comfortably and confidently to watch the problems being solved. The modern technical mind was for the first time at the head of a government. Almost with the air of giving genius its chance, we waited for the performance to begin." Now, the best way to think about Hoover's philosophy of government is that he was not a conservative in the mold of Harding or Coolidge. Economic orthodox theory states that business downturns are an inevitable part of the business cycle, and when a downturn occurs, the government should refrain from interfering with recovery. Now, this would have been the path followed by Harding and Coolidge, but Hoover was a progressive who believed in something that's been called government-stimulated voluntary cooperation. The government should lead by laying out the nation's problems, stating what they are, and then give individuals and businesses a chance to voluntarily cooperate to solve a problem. Now, if that doesn't work, there is room for government direction and intervention. Hoover supported only as much intervention as would be needed to solve a crisis. He wasn't interested in prolonging the Great Depression in order to reshape American society. In this respect, he's different than FDR. For Hoover, a crisis is a chance for the government to solve a problem. That's what he'd been doing his whole life, whether it was engineering or World War I, or as Secretary of Commerce or as president, he had been solving problems. Now for FDR, a crisis is a chance for the government to implement reform and restructure American society in a way it couldn't normally do in an atmosphere of calm and prosperity. Throughout the 1930s, FDR constantly worries, if I fix the economy and we recover too quick, I won't be able to implement reforms. So in a way, FDR kind of wanted the Great Depression to last longer so that he could implement more reform. Now, the traditional view of historians is that Hoover was a do-nothing president when it came to combating the Depression. This is the conventional view, but it's wrong. Hoover took a number of steps to alleviate the Great Depression, and he's even sometimes referred to as the first New Dealer. Even before the crash, Hoover summoned a special session of Congress to deal with the agricultural depression that had plagued American farmers throughout the 1920s. He calls this in the summer of 1929. The Congress passes a law called the Agricultural Marketing Act, the Agricultural Marketing Act. This creates something called the Federal Farm Board. This federal agency had $500 million to promote agricultural cooperatives and stabilization corporations. So basically, they were going to help farmers get more money for their crops. So Hoover does that before the crash. Now, in November 1929, just after the crash, Hoover called a meeting of the nation's leaders in banking, railroads, manufacturing, and public utilities. They met at the White House for about 2 weeks. Hoover urged these leaders to maintain high wages. He believed that the Depression should affect profits, not wages. Hoover said, quote, "The first shock must fall on profits and not on wages." Hoover believed this would sustain the dignity of the individual worker and also sustain the purchasing power of the American worker. Hoover was a believer in something called the underconsumption or high wage doctrine. Henry Ford popularized this idea in 1914. He later explained it in his book, My Life and Work. This is what Henry Ford said: "If we can distribute high wages, then that money is going to be spent, and it will serve to make storekeepers and distributors and manufacturers and workers in other lines more prosperous, and their prosperity will be reflected in our sales. Countrywide high wages spells countrywide prosperity." Now, in December of 1929, so a month later, Hoover summarized the results of his Conference of Industrial Leaders. So in addition to maintaining high wages, Hoover announced other measures taken to prevent a depression. The Federal Reserve System was easing credit, and they were refusing discounts to banks that made stock market call loans. Hoover also announced that railway and public utilities executives had agreed to expand their building and maintenance programs. Hoover also wired governors of each state and the mayors of major cities to suggest that, quote, "roads, street, public building, and other construction of this type could be speeded up and adjusted in such a fashion as to further employment." Within a few months, Hoover requested $140 million from Congress for new public buildings. So to summarize so far, he's helped farmers. He has received a guarantee from business leaders not to cut wages. They'll cut their profits first. The Federal Reserve is easing credit and trying to make buying stocks on margin more difficult. And Hoover's called for more spending on public works. So Hoover's taken a number of steps. In May 1930, he tells the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that, quote, "I am convinced that we have passed the worst, and with continued effort we shall speedily recover." This political cartoon from Judge shows Hoover as Santa Claus bringing lots of presents to the American citizen. So early on, Hoover is not seen as a bumbling idiot who can't fix the Depression. He's actually seen as a very smart guy who knows what he's doing. After his announcement that the worst part of the Depression is over, Hoover takes another step. In June of 1930, he signed something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. This raises import duties to their highest level in American history. This tariff raises taxes on foreign products sold within the United States. It raised import duties about 59% overall. Other countries reacted and a tariff war ensued. This made it more difficult for Americans to sell their products abroad, and it made more difficult for foreigners to sell their products in America. There's all kinds of retaliation. Spain retaliated with a 150% tariff on American cars. Italy responded with a 500% tariff on American radios. Overall, American exports dropped from $7 billion in 1929 to $3 billion in 1932. Most historians, liberal and conservative, see Smoot-Hawley as an economic disaster. So far, Hoover seems to be taking action. David M. Kennedy says, quote, "Measured against either past or future performance, his accomplishment was remarkable." So, this historian sees Hoover as doing a good job. Stocks are recovering, banks are failing, but not at an unprecedented rate. Deposits in the Federal Reserve member banks are going up. However, things are about to get a lot worse for Hoover and the country. There was a banking panic in the late 1930. So in 1930, from January to October, about 600 banks fail. Now that's a little bit more than average, but it's not unprecedented. But then from November to December of 1930, more than 600 banks fail. So this brings the total for 1930 to about 13 or 1400. That's a catastrophe. By the end of 1930, some 26,000 businesses had failed. By early 1932, the unemployment rate is 20%. That's over 10 million people out of work. The economic situation in Europe starts to get worse, so things are getting bad. The Republicans suffered in the 1930 elections. The new Congress, it's the 72nd Congress. They'll be referred to as the Depression Congress. They get elected. The Democrats kind of take control. John Nance Garner, he's going to be Speaker of the House. He's a Democrat from Texas. Joseph T. Robinson, he'll be the Democrat leader in the Senate. He's from Arkansas. And Democrats didn't really want to help Hoover. David M. Kennedy says in Freedom from Fear, quote, "The main purpose of Garner, Robinson, and Raskob was to obstruct the president and to prepare to reap the political reward in the upcoming presidential election." A lot of Democrats said, hey, if this depression continues, we're going to capture the presidency in 1932. We'll win the election. Now, in the face of this new, more serious problem, Hoover launches a second program to respond to the Great Depression. And this was a big moment for Herbert Hoover. I want to read another part from Kennedy. He says, "At this moment, Hoover stood on the shore of a political and ideological Rubicon. He had gingerly waded into it more than 2 years earlier with the creation of federally funded agricultural stabilization corporations. Now he plunged in deeply. Desperate to save the banking system, disappointed at the timidity of private capital, and faced with the business community's own demand for governmental action, he proposed a series of measures that amounted to a repudiation of his own voluntaristic principles. Sometimes lumped together as Hoover's second program against the Depression, these measures would eventually help to revolutionize the American financial world. They would lay the groundwork for a broader restructuring of government's role in many other sectors of American life, a restructuring known as the New Deal." So basically, Hoover believed in voluntary programs, but now the Depression gets worse and he crosses the Rubicon, meaning there's no going back. He crosses from voluntary action by the American people into government-directed action. Hoover raises taxes in the Revenue Act of 1932. He raised taxes across the board and brought in 500,000 new taxpayers into the federal revenue net by reducing low-income exemptions. Hoover was doing this to try to balance the budget. Personal income and corporate taxes go up. The historian David Bido says, quote, "As a percentage of the national income, taxes nearly doubled from 11.6% in 1929 to 21.1% in 1932. So Hoover raises taxes so the government has more money to combat the Depression. In October 1931, Hoover meets with bankers. Out of these talks comes something called the National Credit Association. They raise $500 million for weak banks, so they're kind of trying to bail out the weaker banks. In January 1932, after Hoover felt this National Credit Association wasn't working, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was born. The RFC was supposed to provide emergency loans to banks, railroads, and other entities. Business Week called the RFC, quote, "the most powerful offensive force against the Depression that governmental and business imagination has so far been able to command." And this really was a radical idea. Senator George Norris of Nebraska, he said, "I have been called a socialist, a Bolshevik, a communist, and a lot of other terms of a similar nature. But in the wildest flights of my imagination, I never thought of such a thing as putting the government into business as far as this bill would put it in." Later on, Hoover signs the Glass-Steagall Act in February of 1932. This broadened the definition of acceptable collateral for the Federal Reserve System loans and for the issue of Federal Reserve notes. In July 1932, Hoover signs the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which tries to help people stay in their homes so they don't get foreclosed on. Hoover established a couple voluntary committees to stimulate local government and charitable giving, the President's Emergency Committee for Employment, and then later the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief. But private relief has its limits, and here's kind of two examples. In New York City, public and private relief spending amounted to $79 million in 1932. That amount was less than 1 month's loss of wages for the 800,000 unemployed in New York City. In Chicago, it was estimated that lost wages from unemployment were $2 million a day in late 1931, and at that same time, relief expenditures totaled just $100,000 a day. The Chicago mayor, Anton Cermak, he told a House committee that the federal government could either send relief or troops to Chicago. That's how bad it was. Hoover passes something called the Emergency Relief and Construction Act. This authorized federal unemployment relief and spending on public works. It authorized the RFC to finance up to $1.5 billion in public works spending and to loan $300 million to states for relief purposes. This is the first law dealing with federal unemployment relief. At that time, if you lost your job, the federal government gave you no help, and now it's starting to. So looking at all these steps, it's clear that Hoover's not a do-nothing president. Rexford G. Tugwell, he's a later official in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. He says this about Hoover. Practically the whole New Deal was extrapolated from programs that Hoover started. When it was all over, I once made a list of New Deal ventures begun during Hoover's years as Secretary of Commerce and then as president. I had to conclude that his policies were substantially correct. The New Deal owed much to what he had begun. Hoover had wanted and had said clearly enough that he wanted nearly all the changes now brought under the New Deal label. So this guy, Tugwell from FDR's New Deal administration, he looked back and he said, look, Hoover started most of the things we're trying to implement now. Hoover himself said, quote, I have launched the most gigantic program of economic defense and counterattack ever involved in the history of the Republic. And that's true. Hoover had done more than anyone before him. Now, despite all these efforts by Hoover and by federal, state, and local governments, the Depression persisted. Here's a great quote from Kennedy's book that kind of paints a picture of what the Depression was like. So, it was now the third winter of the Depression. In the long, blighted countryside, unmarketable crops rotted in fields, and unsellable livestock died on the hoof. In towns and cities across the country, haggard men in shabby overcoats, collars turned up against the chill wind, newspapers plugging the holes in their shoes, lined up gloomily for handouts at soup kitchens. Tens of thousands of displaced workers took to the roads, thumbs up, hitching west, huddled in boxcars, heading south, drifting north, east, wherever the highways and the railroads led, wherever there might be a job. Those who stayed put hunkered down, took in their jobless relatives, kited the grocery bills at the corner store, patched their old clothes, darned and redarned their socks, tried to shore up some fragments of hope against the ruins of their dreams. So the Great Depression is really hurting a lot of people. Thousands line up for soup kitchens or sell apples on the sidewalk. Corporations start to cut wages and then they lay off workers. People talked about the spectacle of dire want in the midst of plenty. Sometimes in the countryside there was a lot of food, and then in the cities there'd be people going hungry. To make matters worse, something called the Dust Bowl is happening at the same time as the Depression. This gave rise to the phrase the Dirty 30s because the Dust Bowl just blows dust everywhere. Too many farmers had been plowing up the land. Back in World War I, the government said, we need to feed Europe, so farmers plowed up a lot of land. And also you have tractors and other technologies making it easier for farmers to plow up more land. There was also an extreme drought, and you have high winds. You could have dust storms that were 8,000 feet high, and they would blow 100 miles an hour. Dust from Kansas blows all the way to the East Coast, to Boston, New York, and Washington. Hundreds of thousands of people pack up and leave the Midwest because of the Depression and the Dust Bowl. People who migrate because of the Dust Bowl are called Okies or Exodusters. John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath talks about this, kind of has a story about a family that goes through this. Most people pack up and move to the West Coast, to California, Oregon, or Washington. Some 800,000 people left the Midwest because of this. And the nation starts to turn on Herbert Hoover. Maybe the great engineer, the great humanitarian didn't have all the answers. People started to refer to it as the Hoover Depression. Cardboard shanty towns were called Hoovervilles. Empty pockets were called Hoover flags. Newspapers were called Hoover blankets. There was a joke during the Depression that was told. So Hoover goes up to someone and he asks for a nickel so that he can telephone a friend. And instead, this person flips him a dime and says, "Here, call them both." So Hoover's kind of not having any more friends. Hoover suffers one more humiliation before the 1932 election. World War I veterans had been promised a pension that was supposed to be paid in 1945, but because the Great Depression is so bad, they want their pension now. They don't want to wait another 15 years for it. So, 10 to 20,000 march on Washington and they camp out demanding their pension. Hoover refuses to meet with them. The Senate votes not to give them their pensions early. Eventually, district and federal troops, the federal troops are led by Douglas MacArthur. They drive the veterans from their campsite on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. The soldiers used fixed bayonets, tear gas, cavalry, and tanks. They burned the veterans' shacks. After the veterans were driven away from the Capitol, the Washington Daily News wrote, quote, "What a pitiful spectacle. The mightiest government in the world chasing unarmed men, women, and children with army tanks. If the army must be called out to make war on unarmed citizens, this is no longer America." And I've got a little clip I want you to watch that it's some newsreel footage from the Bonus Army's March on Washington, but you can watch that here.
In 1932, Washington was under siege. The capital was surrounded by over 10,000 unemployed veterans of World War I from all over the country. Their only assets were the bonus certificates they'd been given after the war, which promised a cash bonus sometime in the future. They needed it now.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
What that brought you to Washington?
Well, to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism.
President Hoover was left to deal with the veterans when the Senate rejected their demands. The marchers had stayed, camped out in central Washington.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. And I had a press card, so I passed the police lines, and then I saw the soldiers advancing into the camp. And when confronted with this, the men all stood there and said, "Stand firm as long as you can." And they started throwing tear gas. I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there. I was thinking of Herbert Hoover when this happened, because his election was in 3 months. I thought this would be the finish of Hoover.
The orders of the president must be obeyed, and the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.
Okay, so what caused the Great Depression? Before we look at FDR and how he tackled the Great Depression, let's look at some common explanations for why the Great Depression happened. There's a number of standard textbook reasons. Some of these explanations are causes and some are symptoms, but sometimes symptoms can exacerbate the cause and then become causes in themselves. You know, some people pointed to the weakness of the economy. You had a decade of stagnation in agriculture, flattening sales in automobile and housing markets, the abuses by speculators on Wall Street, the evaporation of assets in the crash, the woes of an archaic banking system. Some people blame credit purchasing. You know, too many people are consuming things on credit and becoming overextended financially. Some people blame Federal Reserve monetary policy. Some blame the government for creating laws that cause too much regulation, such as unit banking laws, the McFadden Act, the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Some blame the drying up of credit and spending and production. Some blame overproduction. Some say bank runs created a panic that exacerbated the problem and kind of crashed the financial system, the banking system. Some point to the purchasing power theory. This theory held that unequal distribution of wealth in the 1920s meant the rich were making a killing, but the average worker wasn't. You know, people that believe in this theory, they said, who buys more radios and other consumer goods? You know, one person with $1 million or 1,000 workers with $1,000 each. These people tend to blame the Republicans of the 1920s. They deserve blame for focusing on business and not workers. Some blamed American structural deficiencies and institutional inadequacies. You know, it's capitalism's fault. It's the business cycle's fault. Some people blame World War I and the Versailles Treaty and the post-war settlement. Herbert Hoover was foremost among these. He really thought it was Europe's fault. Despite all these different ideas, no scholar has definitively proven what caused the Great Depression. You know, it's still a hotly contested question. My college professor said in class, the first historian or economist who definitively proves what causes the Great Depression, he'll win the Nobel Prize in economics. Liberal scholars tend to blame the Republican policies of the 1920s, capital, and a lack of federal intervention for the Great Depression. Conservative scholars tend to blame the Federal Reserve System, too much regulation, and the natural cycle of business. So next lecture we'll kind of introduce FDR and we'll start to talk about how he tackled the Great Depression with his program, the New Deal.